Hi, welcome to episode 17 of Think Like a Hacker. Today we have a real treat for you. I actually spent some time one-on-one in real life with Mikey Veenstra talking about some of the research that he's been doing lately into some plugin vulnerabilities. Let's get into it. Hi, this is Kathy Zant with Think Like a Hacker podcast, and we are in downtown Tempe, Arizona with one of our threat researchers, Mikey Veenstra, who also lives here in Phoenix with me, although we live on opposite sides of the valley. But we met down here to talk about some of the research that our threat intel team is doing this week. We have a number of big announcements that are coming out, and wanted to get together with Mikey and get the low down, dirty news on what's happening. What's this plugin that you're researching right now, that you're as the time of the publication of this podcast and your blog post should be coinciding somewhat, so you can talk freely about what you found with, what's the name of the plugin?
Plugin is called Convert Plus. The slug is Convert Plug. There was a rebranding at some point. But yeah, it's a premium plugin with just shy of 100,000 users by my estimate. Our director of threat intelligence, Sean Murphy, discovered a vulnerability last Friday that would allow unauthenticated attackers to create administrator users on sites with the plugin.
Wow, so that's a pretty big vulnerability.
Yeah, if you've got administrative rights to a site, you effectively own that site, both in the hacker speak version of the word and then the ownership term.
Wow.
Yeah, what's basically going on in the vuln is there's so the plugin itself lets you do all kinds of like marketing pop-ups or, subscribe now, info bars and stuff like that. Any of those where any kind of input is taken can be treated as a subscriber form, and it takes like an email address as input, but there's also a parameter that an admin can set, so any new subscriber is given a special role, whether it's something unique that they've built in WordPress, or maybe they want a contributor sign-up form, or I don't presume why they would have put that there, but what was happening is anybody on the input side, on the client side, can just change that hidden field to say administrator.
Gotcha.
And then submit the form, and their new user is an administrator.
Okay, were we seeing any exploits in the wild of this plugin?
No, we've discovered this ourselves. We reported it to the vendors right away, and it has already been patched.
Okay, great. So if somebody does have this plugin on their site, they should update immediately and they'll have the fix?
Yep, it'll be fixed. Version 3.4.3 is the patched version of that plugin.
And our firewall protects against this vulnerability being exploited?
Yep, yeah, we've got, so yesterday at the time of this going live, the new firewall rule would have gone out. So that'll affect our premium users, and then free users will get that in 30 days.
Excellent, great. But you've been busy with some other research as well?
Yes, so do you want the good news or the bad news?
Let's be optimistic and take the good news first.
Okay, good news first. So there's a plugin called WP Database Backup.
Okay.
This one is a repository plugin, so it is free. It's on the .org repo. There was an irresponsible disclosure about a month ago, a little more than a month ago.
Is it the same guy?
Yeah, it's the one you're thinking of.
Okay.
And in this disclosure, a settings change vulnerability was discussed. So the idea is an unauthenticated user can tweak the settings of this plugin, and the exploit example, or the kill chain in this case, in that example was that they could tweak the email address of backup files. So they could set their own attacker email address as the destination of a backup script, or the backup file that gets generated, and then turn on the thing that says email the file. So even if you weren't getting your backups emailed to you, the attacker can, and that can expose definitely some sensitive information, some hashes of user credentials and things like that. It's definitely not good, but when we went and continued reviewing that plugin, we found another setting that fell under the same vulnerability, but had not gotten any attention. This setting allowed excluded tables to be set.
Okay.
So in the backup script, when it runs, you've got 100 database tables or something because
Sure.
you've got a crazy number of plugins. You can select a few that you don't want to be backed up as part of this.
Okay.
And when the plugin iterates over that list, it's actually building just a big long bash command that runs MySQL dump. And so every ignored table is just another -- ignore table equals blank, -- ignore table equals blank. And because none of that had been sanitized, if you control that value as an attacker, now you can just make it like a bash subshell if you want. So my ignored table is $parentheses bash command, and then it would run the next time a backup would execute.
Okay, great. All right, and so how many installs did this one have?
This one is just north of 70,000.
So still a lot of people who are affected by this?
Yes, and
Okay.
the classification of this one is an OS command injection.
Okay, yeah, so this can cause problems beyond just WordPress. It could cause problems with the entire hosting account?
Yeah, anything, whatever permissions that PHP is running as, it'll run it at the bash level. And then from there you can generate new files, which is the proof of concept that we shared with the developers to spawn up a shell or something like that.
Yeah.
But it can extend to system level stuff, like opening a listener for a reverse shell or a interpreter or something like that.
Okay, great. And this has been fixed now?
Yes, this one has been fixed.
Okay.
We contacted them as soon as we found it. It was the same day that the original disclosure came out, and a patch was live within a couple of weeks of that.
Okay, great. And our firewall is protecting against this if somebody hasn't updated yet?
Correct. And at this point, it's been out for 30 days, so free users have it too.
Oh, so free users are protected at this time of this publication?
As of like 3 days ago, yeah.
Wow.
I think, maybe longer.
Okay, great, awesome. All right, so you've got some bad news?
Yeah, so not all of these stories have happy endings necessarily. So there was another one. So thankfully, this plugin had a much smaller install base. So it's a plugin called Slick Pop-Up, another sort of marketing style modal pop-up plugin for your WordPress site. I don't know if I said it has about 7,000 users. And this one had a vulnerability where anybody of at least subscriber permissions, so they had to have an account.
Okay.
But they didn't have to have any special privileges on that account. There was an AJAX action that they could hit that would create a support user for the Slick Pop-Up plugin development team. The problem is that this user always has the same username and email address and a hard-coded password that is in the plugin itself.
Oh boy.
And it's been the same one for quite a while. So the idea is any subscriber on an affected site can create an administrator account that has a password they know. So the email address doesn't go somewhere they control, it goes to Slick Pop-Up, and they'll actually get an email, by the way, if it ever does get exploited, that somebody's requested support assistance, but the attacker knows the password, and it has administrator permissions.
Okay,
and
so if somebody has a WordPress install and they're allowing anybody to subscribe,
yes.
that would automatically make them vulnerable, even though, because someone could actually subscribe, create that account, and then that could get escalated into an administrator.
Yeah, well, so they wouldn't be escalating their own account, but creating a new one.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah, it's scary because, again, in WordPress, an administrator can do anything.
Okay, gotcha. And this is patched?
No, so this is where the bad news comes in.
This is the bad news,
so,
okay.
This is, we've had cases where we do a disclosure and nothing happens. And it's always sort of a shame. But this is the first time where we've gotten a response and then still nothing happened. So we've been ghosted before.
Okay.
But the developers worked with me. They got back to me a couple of days after the initial disclosure, and they said, okay, we're going to issue a fix. And then I heard nothing for weeks. And then I was notified by them that it was fixed, but it wasn't. So there was some mix-up on their end where a professional, like their backend pro version had been patched, and I haven't verified that or anything yet, but not the free version that's on the repo.
Okay.
And then so that's the one that's under our wheelhouse, and that's where we draw attention. So that's been.
What exactly is our policy and our procedure? We have a pretty strict policy and procedure for when we find a vulnerability. What is it that we do, or our threat intel team does when this happens? So
the basic time frames, we are going to notify the development team, and that sort of starts the stopwatch. If we don't hear anything back at all for 14 days, we consider it abandoned or whatever word you want to assign to it, and that sets its own deadline. So if we hear nothing for 2 weeks at all, then we're going to consider it open for public disclosure, because we can't say that it's going to be patched and people need to know. If developers do work with us and acknowledge things, and there's that back and forth there where we've been receiving confirmation and things like that, then it goes for 30 days. And we've had cases where extensions are fine, especially like service vulnerabilities we've disclosed. But in this case, there wasn't any request for anything like that. It was just, we're going to fix it, and then radio silence for
nothing
a while.
Happened. And you followed up with them and tried to keep that conversation going, but we weren't getting anything.
Yeah, and they've been corresponding, but just no patch and no real news about one. So the plugin, as of a couple of hours ago, has been removed from the repository. They have another plugin as well with like less than 100 or a dozen users that had the same code in it as well, and that's also been zapped. That was Contact Form 7 spam remover plugin by the same developers, but yeah, same code and off the repo now.
All right, and I have to ask if our firewall protects about something like this?
Yes.
It does, okay.
Yep, we've got that one added as well. That one has also been, just because the 30-day time frame, we put the rule in back at the very beginning of it. So it's open for free users now, so there's that at least. With
these other ones, have we seen any active exploitation of these happening out in the wild?
Not yet. Okay. So these are very new disclosures. We have no reason to think that the bad actors have access to this just yet. It's hard to say if we'll see it, because some of these are pretty doozy.
I think this has been great to be able to sit down with you and just talk about some of the research that you've been doing and all of the work that's gone in behind the scenes protecting WordPress users from these types of exploits before they're ever, or types of vulnerabilities before they're ever actively exploited. So thanks for sitting down with me, Mikey.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So this week, Mark is busy putting the final touches on a video project we've been working on for a while. Some of you may have heard a little bit about this. I'm very excited to share it with you, but it's not quite there yet. He's under deadline. So this week, I'm doing the news by myself, but how boring is that? Just me sitting here talking to the camera. So my friend and colleague, Mikey Veenstra, who we just spoke to about some plugin vulnerabilities, is here to talk about the news with me, because that's much more fun, isn't it?
For me, it is.
It's more fun for me, too. So we have some interesting stories, and we'll get right into it. Woo. So, Mikey, it looks like we have a vulnerability in Docker that we just heard about this morning on a security list. What do you know about this?
So I've gotten myself up to speed on this just fairly recently. It's a race condition flaw in Docker, all versions currently. I don't think there's a patch yet, that can potentially allow a Docker container or something running within it to read and write files from the parent host, which is capital B, capital N, bad news. It's a TOC/TOU, so time of check to time of use attack.
Okay, can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so it's just sort of a category of race conditions.
Okay.
So in general, a race condition in a vulnerability is when there's two things that can be happening, and it's timing based. So if this second thing happens at exactly the right part of the process this first thing is doing, then something happens. Okay. In this case, so the time of check to time of use means that we are checking on our permission to do something, or the capability, or a configuration, or anything. Can we do this, or are we supposed to do this? Okay. And we're checking that. And then sometime between when we're checking it and when we're doing it, something changes about it in the middle.
Okay, so there's like this little window in between these two checks
Exactly.
that allows something else to happen, and that something else is an escalation of privilege based on what, symlinks?
Yeah, so in this case, it's based on symlinks. So step one is we're checking that this path is something that we're allowed to read or write to.
Yeah.
And then question mark. And then step three is write to it or read from it. And so if in between checking and doing, that path were to change. So if it were a symbolic link we were checking and then the path of that link changed from one file to a different file, then we can see some exploitation there.
Excellent. Okay. Interesting. It sounds like there's not a fix yet, that this was
Not
just
yet.
announced, but it sounds like it's pretty small window of possibility that something's going to happen with this, but people who are using Docker containers for their websites or anything else really need to keep an eye on a patch coming for this.
Yeah, definitely want to patch early. As far as directly portable exploitability, I'm not certain. I'm pretty cemented in my web appy WordPressy sphere, but it's definitely something I would keep an eye out for and make sure that we're patching as soon as it's available.
Yeah, definitely. Did you read this article about the SimPort hack? This is crazy. You know, the first thing I did after I read this was posted on Medium on May 20th, and the title of the article was "The Most Expensive Lesson of My Life, Details of a SimPort Hack." And the subhead was, this guy had basically lost $100,000 last Wednesday from a SimPort hack. And we had talked about this a number of times as we've been talking about two-factor authentication and all of these other exploits that have occurred that have taken place using SIM cards. But this guy walks through the process of what happened to him in such a real way. The first thing I did is I got rid of all of my SIM-based tooling. I had a few left over. They're gone now. That's never going to happen to me, because that was a frightening story that this would actually happen. So this guy probably had strong passwords from what I can tell from this story, but because they gained access to a SIM card that was attached to his number, they were able to do sort of a forgot password routine. And there's a flow of events of what happens to this individual that, from his perspective, his name was Sean Kuntz, and he's very into cryptocurrency, and their ultimate goal was to get into his Coinbase account. And as the attack was occurring, he was getting some signs that something was wrong. Did you notice anything that would have triggered you?
Yeah, so the first thing mentioned in here is that there was no service on the phone at all. And so I have kind of the opposite response when that happens to the writer here. So in this case, the author was in bed and tired, and you could just chalk it up as just a blip in cell coverage. And ultimately, I probably would have too. But there's always that cold sweat when my service goes away. Like, oh man. And my attack surface is much smaller. I don't have $100,000 sitting in a Coinbase account to worry about. But it's really unfortunate, and I don't know, we could rant about SMS two-factor enough to call it a podcast, but I think the evidence is already there. Yeah,
it's definitely interesting to read through all of this, because it really drives home what was happening, what the attacker was doing, the evidence that was being shown to this user that he was actually a victim of an attack, and what his response was during that time frame, and then what, in retrospect, what his response should have been. And it really kind of illustrates how often we have a security event happen, and we write it off as just a coincidence, or we write it off as, oh, well, this might be happening, or, oh, I just got a new telephone, or I just had my phone repaired. He had just had his screen repaired, so he thought, oh, there's something just going on with my phone. And so he just discounted all of the evidence as it was being presented to him, went to bed, and boom, found out that his cryptocurrency account was drained. So when we talk about why we're no longer, or why we have made the cell phone sign-in for Word Fence legacy and are moving everybody towards authenticator-based two-factor authentication, this is a perfect story why. And it's definitely, this podcast isn't going to do this article justice. Definitely go to the show notes and take a look at this, because it's really walks you through the process and illustrates what's going on. Have you been looking at this Microsoft zero-day exploits that have been, or vulnerabilities that have been posted? Actually, no, they are exploits, aren't they? They're proof of concepts that are ending up on GitHub.
Yeah, I've been loosely following this because, again, WordPress bubble, but it's kind of hard to be in the security space and not notice this, and it's gross.
And kind of familiar?
A little bit, yeah. It's tough because you want to say, you know, release all of the information ever into the world, because eventually it'll get sorted out. But it's hard to see it when it's kind of clearly done in bad faith.
Yeah, definitely. So this was reported in a number of places. It was reported by, I think, Catalin Kimpanu on ZDNet, and it was also reported on Forbes. The Forbes article really went into the motivations that the security researcher had in releasing these zero-day exploits on GitHub, and looked at the fact that this the security researcher was, the vulnerabilities that were being released were basically local privilege execution or escalation exploits, which is basically saying, okay, I'm just like a normal user, all of a sudden, boom, I can now become an administrator. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the general workflow, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and so most of these exploits had, or vulnerabilities and exploits had been within that arena. The security research had a bone to pick with, it looks like, the FBI, and they have a blog where they're writing kind of in depth and talking about what they feel about a perceived injustice. So they have a bone to pick. So there's some ethics around this. Obviously, as a security researcher, you come across information all the time that puts lots of people at risk, and there are some ethics associated that sort of drive what you're doing as a researcher, right?
Yeah, well, and really in this industry, you're only as valuable as your sort of perceived trust in this space. If you're seen as a bad faith actor, or if you are associated with spreading FUD or anything on any side of that, it's pretty quick to move towards getting ostracized from the community, or at least made a laughingstock of. But in this case, this is sort of like, this is good research. This is like, these are bombshell findings, but they're being just dropped for the sake of dropping them to make a point.
Yeah. And
like, when we've dealt on our own end with irresponsible disclosures that we've had to deal with the aftermaths of, when these actors are being called out for it, there's always people on the other side saying, you know, it's a slippery slope. If we're pointing fingers and saying that the researcher is the bad guy in this case, where does it end? And it's really tough, because you know, you want there to be standards in this space, and you want everybody to be working towards the better good of the technology and the better good of the people using it, rather than just spreading weapons around.
Right, yeah. And I think, you know, and our next story kind of illustrates this a little bit too, because we're going to talk about some security researchers that, you know, others might see as our competitors, but, you know, we follow their research, they follow our research, and we have, it's not as a competitive space anymore. We're all like doing things for the good of the user, rather than doing something because, you know, there's an ego need, or we're doing something to prove a point, or to, you know, like the security researcher we've run into in the past who has a bone to pick, who's doing it to show off what he can do and to prove a point to the plugin repository. But the industry seems to be moving more towards collaboration and doing things for the good of the user base and the good of the entire computing world as a whole, rather than for their own needs, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of getting into the DNA of tech culture, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
5 years ago, doing the kind of disclosures that I'm emailing people about now would have gotten legal threats in response for the most part. But I think the community is becoming more aware that there are people doing this for good reasons, and for a lot of these people, yeah, of course they want something out of it, but that something usually just amounts to just a public pat on the back or something. For some of the smaller shops, there's bug bounty programs that people are picking up and things like that. So it's getting there, and it's getting there in a really good way. But I think there's always going to be the people that just want to watch the world burn.
Sure. Well, our friends over at GoDaddy Security have written on the Security blog about a vulnerability, cross-site scripting vulnerability that was found in the Slimstat plugin, and that has a lot of users, doesn't it?
Yeah, that one does. That one's over 100,000 users. And the vulnerability itself has to do with just handling some analytics data,
Okay.
but it's not sanitized, and so that data can be spoofed, so that an admin viewing these statistics can then be triggering a cross-site scripting payload.
Okay, all right. But it's now patched, and I think it looks like versions under 4.8.1 are vulnerable. So if you are using that plugin, and 100,000 users are, make sure that you have updated. We also see that there is a data breach, an Instagram data breach. Now, it doesn't look like Instagram actually had a breach, but that a social media marketing firm that had access to Instagram data had put that data on an AWS server and did not secure it.
Of course they didn't.
Why would you want to secure anything on AWS, right?
It's already done for you, right?
Yeah, that's where you just put all the fun stuff, right? So this was on May 20th, TechCrunch reported this. A security researcher, Anurag Sen, discovered this database containing records of 49 million Instagram users. And this was some very specific information: bio data, profile picture, number of followers, their location, contact information, and all of this was public. So the security researcher brought it to TechCrunch, who researched this and found that there was quite a bit of influencers and prominent food bloggers. This database looks like it was owned by Chatterbox. Is that how you pronounce that?
That's how I would go about pronouncing it.
Chatterbox, which is a Mumbai-based social media marketing firm that pays influencers, and they disputed the claim that there were 49 million Instagram records, but and said that there were only 350,000 people still. And they said that database was only open for 72 hours, but data seems to say otherwise, in that researcher that found it confirmed that the database was first detected on a search engine for exposed databases. Those exist?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the thing about breaches like this is just, in comparison to the Equifax thing. So the Equifax thing was definitely done by a bad actor.
Sure.
That data is out there and in the hands of bad people. But breaches like this, like when the word breach is used, I'm expecting to hear, well, when did the attacker do this and when was it found? But this is more of a leak, right? Like, we don't have any information suggesting that it's in the hands of bad actors. It was reported more or less responsibly. I mean, it was given to a reporting outlet, but whatever. But if it's been fixed and there's no evidence that somebody with malicious intent had gotten into it, then that's at least a small comfort. I mean, you have to assume the possibility. If you're one of the people affected by it, I would be watching everything like a hawk, just to make sure, because if somebody had gotten into it during that time, they weren't going to be so responsible and tell them about it. Yeah. But hopefully the lack of any news about it means that no evidence has been found.
Yeah. I hope that's the case with our next story.
I hope it's the case with every story.
Wouldn't that be nice? This next story really has quite a few records in it and a very long history of some information being, as you said, leaked. It looks like First American Financial Corp has leaked hundreds of millions of title insurance records. And this was reported, I think, last Friday by Brian Krebs on Security. This is a Fortune 500 real estate title insurance giant. Now, title insurance companies, have you bought a house yet?
No.
No. Okay.
In this economy? I've always wanted to say in this economy.
Now's your chance. You got it. You got it. Wow. You could die happy now. When you buy a house, they want everything. They want pay stubs, they want your bank information, they want to know everything about you, and all of this documentation, this large vat of documentation is handed over, and the title insurance company, has all of this information. So what ended up happening here is these were all digitized, and 885 million, that's a lot, of records were all placed in a web browsable place. It included bank account numbers, statements, mortgage and tax records, and all of these documents were sequential. So that meant if you knew the address of one document, you could just
increment,
change a couple of numbers and see what else you could see.
Yep.
And it wasn't protected. It was discovered by, it looks like a real estate developer who tried to contact First American and was not successful. So
that's always a shame.
it is.
Yeah.
But Brian Krebs was there, and Brian Krebs was listening. And apparently First American listened to Brian Krebs and decided to take that server down. So unfortunately, it looks like archive.org still had some snapshots.
Good job, Wayback. I love the Wayback.
All the way back. Wayback is great when feeling nostalgic. I don't know that I want to feel nostalgic about somebody else's mortgage applications, though.
You're not most people.
I'm not. I'm not a fraudster or a criminal either, and so that kind of stuff is interesting to phishers and scammers who, can.
That's very good pretexting fuel.
Yeah, explain what you mean by that.
Well, yeah, so when you're pretexting somebody in social engineering, you are building a story for why you should have the authority to do the thing you're trying to trick this person into doing. Okay. So, I clearly know all of this information about you. I'm clearly somebody that you've trusted in the past. Time to do more, friend, and we'll start talking about where you need to send money or what passwords you need to tell me and things like that.
Gotcha.
So even if nothing in the data is immediately exploitable, like even if this is all old data because it says it's going back to 2003, was your address blah 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 in 2005? Oh, okay, I have validated your identity. Let's continue this conversation.
Right.
You'd be surprised if somebody validates your identity, that does not validate the person you're talking to.
Sure, right. So if somebody calls up someone and starts just rattling off all this information that obviously only my bank would know, my bank account number and all of this other information, so therefore I can give them my password.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, don't. But this is the part of the disclaimer where nobody who knows what they're doing will ever ask you for this information.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it appears from that Krebs article, it does look like these are the type of scams that are most costly in terms of cybercrime, according to the FBI. So having this kind of information available to anybody who wants to go poking around at it, and it just underscores, one, the importance, if you have personally identifiable information in your care, it's your responsibility to secure it. And if you receive phone calls where people purport to know more about you than they should, always
verify. I mean, it's a little tinfoil hatty to say, anytime anybody calls you, do your diligence and find out who they are and make sure. But incoming phone numbers can be spoofed at almost every case, and if you're not expecting a phone call that suddenly gets very personal, put your shields up. Just think critically.
Good advice. definitely take advice from this man. I do. Have you been following the story of what's happening in Baltimore?
Yeah, I hate it. I want it to be over.
It is pretty bad. It's been going on for 3 weeks now. The New York Times had an interesting article over the weekend, and I was not aware about this when we talked about it last week. I don't know that it was made publicly knowledgeable at the time, but it appears that an NSA hacking tool that was leaked, I think in 2017, called Eternal Blue, and that was when Shadow Brokers.
Yeah, that was the Shadow Breakers one. And then, so Eternal Blue was the one that was used during WannaCry, when WannaCry was going wild. Yeah. So that was the ransomware payload, but the actual vulnerability that was being used to distribute it was Eternal Blue. And it was the Microsoft SMB file share vulnerability.
Okay. Yeah, and so this is the same type of thing. It's a malware variant. I think it's the same malware variant that's been used before, but Eternal Blue kind of helps it spread through that network. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's the vulnerability exploit versus the payload that you're shoving through it. So like if we were to talk about our administrator vulnerability from earlier. So the exploit is you can be an administrator now, and then the payload is whatever you do with that power.
Okay,
so
like malicious redirects or
just spraying more backdoors or what have you. So Eternal Blue is the vector, so this is how we're distributing software, and then the ransomware is the software that we're using to distribute.
Interesting. So Baltimore did not have cyber insurance for things of this nature. Their IT person had asked for it.
Which is a big shame.
It's a big shame, right? Yeah, you put it as a line item on the budget and it doesn't get voted through. And because of that, I sort of suspect that by saying, hey, federal government, this was your tool, we kind of need some help over here, that this is sort of an interesting way to kind of bring the feds in, because the Baltimore is asking the federal government for assistance with this, because basically the city's been shut down and unable to do any kind of business. People can't even buy a house in this economy. They can't even do that in Baltimore because no transactions can be recorded because all the computers are down. And I also heard that the city of Baltimore is like, oh, at least we need to get email back online. So they like mass signed up for Gmail accounts.
Yeah, and then most of them got shut down. Was that what I read?
Yeah, because there were so many signups happening from one network. Google's like, what the heck's going on here? And it just kind of locked them all down. So yeah, Baltimore is in a world of hurt right now, but yeah, people are starting to wonder if maybe, talking about Eternal Blue and how it's being used here is kind of a way to say, hey, if you're going to develop these tools, at least, take some responsibility for what happens when they, get out into the wild, like Jurassic World style.
Yeah, and ownership of that is weird, right? Because, Jurassic World style, if you're, while we're going here. So if you're, and I haven't actually seen that one. I've only seen the super old one. So let's talk 1992.
Let's go. Wayback Machine.
So if you're creating these horrible beasts that end up being unleashed on the citizens of your country, then that's clearly on you. But in this case, if these horrible beasts are released into the wild months or years after a completely foolproof velociraptor repellent is freely available to everybody, then that gets weird. And I'm not a big fan of the NSA spreading a bunch of malware around, and I don't love all that, but I think asking the feds for financial assistance in this sort of thing is a weird precedent, especially it's been years since these sort of things have happened. And if the Fed was going to take responsibility for it at this point, it probably would have happened around the time that all of the medical services in the UK were shutting down over this sort of thing. So I don't know what Baltimore is really in for here, but I am really sorry that it's happening. Yeah,
it's definitely an unfun situation, and it's happened so many times. And I really feel for the IT guys that got to deal with this stuff.
I always feel for the IT guys that have to deal with this stuff. Oh my God.
The hashtag hug ops, right?
Yeah. Hug your sysadmin.
Yeah.
And then listen to them.
Yes. Listen to your sysadmin, totally. Good advice. Yeah, I told you Mikey is here for a reason, to give you tons of good advice.
Behind every ransomware infection is a sysadmin ripping their eyebrows out.
definitely. Because these things tend to happen from like bad passwords and not updating your computer and all the basic security steps that just should be a part of like brushing your digital teeth.
Yeah, or pulling your digital leeches off of your arm or whatever. It's the vulnerability in Eternal Blue. So if we want to get that deep into it, it had been patched for quite a while, and it's just old Windows software just has a really nasty habit of sticking around.
It does, like the uninvited guest at a party, right?
Well, yeah, it's just, and I don't know if this was, the initial vector that it got into the network through, because internally people leave that stuff wide open all the time. Oh, it's in my network, I trust it. But how something got in from the outside, whether it was a gross email attachment or a web app vulnerability or something, I don't know. But
I don't think they even know in Baltimore. I think they're
waiting on their computers to start up.
Kind of hard to know what happened when it's locked, right?
No, I don't know. I'll pour one out for him later, but I don't know about the money thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mikey, for sitting with me today in Tempe and talking about all this fun stuff.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, so we'll have to have you back on your. Whenever you have research, it's like, wow, how do we get Mikey in here?
You just ask. Just depends on what I'm up to lately.
Yeah. Well, you're pretty busy today, so thanks for taking the time for us.
Yeah. Have a good one.